The manorial economy that we discussed in the last lecture began to disintegrate as a consequence of pressures for which it was not really designed. Manorialism in the feudal system that it supported didn't really grow up at a time when there was money in the economy and when there was growth. Rather, it developed at a time of a shrinking economy, a shrinking population, and the localization of all services. But when these situations changed, there were different kinds of demands made, demands that the manorial economy, local as it was and based upon a barter subsistence level, that could not really be met. Consequently, we see change happening, and we see that change developing in every form. We see it happening not only in the local level, on the manor itself, but we also see it on a much larger level, where towns and cities began to control relatively large trading areas and ultimately sow the seeds for long-distance trade. If we think of the manor, we realize with the advent of things like the heavy-wheeled plow, that the metal plowshare had to come from off the manor usually. There wasn't enough iron in order to produce them locally. Similarly, as the Lord demanded more sophisticated castles, the stone had to be brought from a greater distance. Similarly, those caste marks that began to identify the Lord as one of the players in that chivalric drama of caste mark that indicated rank and levels of sophistication. It meant that better quality fabric, better quality armor, better horses, all had to be brought from a greater distance. And these things meant the need of money. Because a barter economy doesn't really permit the movement of things at great distances in order to purchase other things. Really, there's a medium of exchange that is anticipated. That is something that is accepted of value so that things can be moved at great distance in order to ensure that a demand is met by the material available. This happened, of course, on the local level, as we've seen, but it also happened to a much greater degree once there was a set of adventures, a set of events that completely transformed the European continent and began, in fact, a time of rapid growth, and these were the Crusades. In 1095, Pope Urban II preached the Great Crusade at Clermont in France, and soon much of the nobility of Europe gathered underneath the sign of the cross in order to sail the Mediterranean and to relieve the Holy Land from the infidel, from their point of view. And in fact, it was one of the great adventures of the Middle Ages, and one that required almost all of the marshalling of all of the resources of a continent in order to achieve. Because when we think of what we're doing, we're moving thousands, tens of thousands of heavily armed knights across the sea in order to establish beachheads, in fact, to establish a separate Crusader kingdom in another part of the world. And in order to do this, there had to be great capitalization. There had to be the collection of resources and the focusing of interest and desire so powerful that would allow this to in fact happen. The Crusades then provided a moment, and we see around 1100 a fundamental change as a consequence. There needed to be not just the capital required in order to move large numbers of men and horses and retainers and equipment across the ocean, but also there needed to be all of the support networks required to put in place all of the logistics to ensure that this adventure would not only succeed, but would be able to be sustained. Much of the wealth of Europe then tended to funnel into the rich trading cities of the Italian peninsula and to some extent other parts of southern Europe. Cities like Venice and Genoa, Pisa and Amalfi all grew rich as the wealth of Europe began to be focused on these centers in order to move those tens of thousands of Western knights across the Mediterranean. So not just the ships and the ship owners, and not just the sailors, but also the victualers, those who provided the armor and those who provided the food, those who made sure that there was lodging, those who made sure that the armies would be supported once they were landed. All of these then began to achieve a level of success and a level of sophistication that ensured then that the European economy would change quickly and change dramatically, and it would be based upon money. This need, this requirement of capitalization and of a renewed and focused interest also meant that there had to be different mechanisms to make sure that this capital would be well managed and that a Europe-wide adventure of this kind would be to some extent controlled by those who would raise the money and those who would spend it. The consequence was then innovations in business methods, things that in themselves don't seem particularly exciting, but in reality, when applied to a circumstance this large and this dramatic, actually changed the nature of Europe. Business practices actually helped the Europeans ensure that the money that was raised and spent would be well spent and raised in sufficient amounts. So, for example, it was necessary to make double-entry bookkeeping, something developed in Genoa in order to assist the Crusades, more widespread. This was much more efficient as a way of ensuring that a merchant would know exactly how much was owed and how much he had, rather than the old charge-discharge system. Moreover, it was clear that these systems, once put in place, had all kinds of unintended consequences that actually again benefited the Europeans to a large degree. Anything as large as the Crusades that lasted such a long period of time and involved so many places and so many people and required so many sophisticated applications meant that there would be needs that had to be met that had not been needed before. And so, for example, not just the means of communication, such as regular sailings across the Mediterranean and roads that would allow to ensure that there would be proper victualling of large cities from which the Crusaders would depart, but also things that would allow for sufficient capital to be acquired and that capital to be kept liquid. And this, in fact, led to the rise of banking. One of the effects, of course, of trade in any kind is the production of capital. One of the reasons why traders and merchants engaged in the activity was to ensure that there would be sufficient capital available for them to continue their trade and also to provide for members of their family and also members of their community who chose to invest their capital with them. One of the innovations that actually made the Crusades possible was moving beyond the simple family business organization, a simple group of relatives or group of closely associated people who would pool what capital was available to acquire a particular good or to engage in a particular objective. But in fact, something like the Crusades required more capital than that. So an arrangement was made whereby a number of investors would pool their capital in order to achieve a particular goal, and there would be an understanding based on a contract as to what kind of return would be available according to the amount of the investment. Now, the investment, of course, could be the obvious investment of money. The more you put in, the more you should get back. But then there were other elements as well. For example, there was the investment of time in actually making the voyage to ensure that the goods would be purchased and returned. There would be the danger involved because the Mediterranean, and in fact much of Europe, was still quite a dangerous place. And then there was also the ambition and the imagination to seek out new markets and to take chances based upon ideas. These new trading ventures and these new organizations permitted young men with ideas and courage, but little capital, to engage in this kind of adventure, to use what they had, and that is their personalities and their courage, to try and build fortunes, even though they themselves did not have the capital to begin with. This benefited not only them because it added a whole new element of dynamic and a whole new element of courage and imagination and a whole new collection of ideas to the European extension of power and enterprise that constituted the Crusades, because the Crusades must be seen as not just this adventure to capture the Holy Land, but in fact one of the first colonial and imperial exercises of Europe since the collapse of Rome. That is the extension of European power and settlement off the continent into other areas. And of course, because a trade is piracy by other means, the fact that war was involved meant very little, that in fact there still was trade, there still was connection, and there still was the exchange of goods, whether paid for or not. Also, besides the opportunity for young men to engage in trade and to use their imagination and their courage and their ideas in order to get wealthy, the fact that they were willing to do it meant that older, wealthier merchants, those who had already acquired substantial amounts of capital, could stay home. No longer do they have to travel to the fairs of Champagne, or no longer do they have to sail the Mediterranean to Constantinople or to Acre. Now, in fact, they could stay in their cities in Italy or in France or wherever and begin to use their capital not only to make more money, but also the capital to establish an element of power and authority within the walls of their town. These experienced cosmopolitan merchants, knowledgeable of the ways of the world, familiar with law and contracts, able to negotiate, often familiar with foreign languages and different banking systems and different currency systems, could in fact be useful, powerful individuals in the creation of a city-state or in the ruling of a city and in negotiations with powers like the king. We've already seen how there's a natural union, a natural collaboration between the central power and the town. Both wanted to reduce the power of the local nobility, and both wanted to ensure that there was an element of trade based on capital, based on money, that would then permit an element of flexibility that the feudal and manorial system could not support. So these wealthy individuals in towns, these merchants, these sophisticated individuals, then could take over the rule of their city, and that they could turn their cities into powerful instruments of economic and ultimately social and political change. Once they left the walls of their town, they had no status. They had no status or privilege in the eyes of the nobility. The richest merchant was still despised by the poorest knight. But within the towns, and in negotiation with princes and kings, sitting in the Estates General as representatives of the Third Estate or in Parliament, they had enormous influence and power, and they were able to exercise this in a way that was impossible without, in fact, this concentration of capital and these new business organizations. Also, it wasn't just mercantile activity. These wealthy merchants staying in town, receiving their profits from these adventures in the Crusades and other long-distance luxury trading adventures, knew that they in fact had more money than they needed. Previously, the amount of capital that was available was enough to service small enterprises engaged in relatively local activities. But now, when you're dealing across the Mediterranean, when you're going to Constantinople, when you're carrying luxury goods of great value over long distances, you need substantial amounts of capital. And so the ability then to concentrate and pool capital in one place, managed by experienced and knowledgeable men, ensured that there would be, in fact, great profits to be made, and great profits were made. Profits, in fact, to the point that it was not necessary to use them all in order to sustain this mercantile activity. Profits so large that there was enough left that these could be lent to other merchants who lacked capital, but again had an exciting idea or a good, what we now call, business plan. So it was a very, very small leap for these merchants to move from being merchants to becoming bankers. There's no point in having surplus capital and just putting it in a sock and burying it in the garden, although today, in fact, it might seem like a good return. The advantage was that if you have surplus capital, you can make it available to others, knowing that that capital would provide them with an advantage, but also you with interest. Now, there were, of course, canonical restrictions on taking money at interest and what was called usury. These, though, were not terribly rigorously imposed, in part because the church itself and popes needed money, and also because there were so many ways around it. The usual was to lend money in one currency and expect payment in another, and the difference in value would be your profit. There were other mechanisms the church allowed for there to be profit taken if there should be risk of life or risk of loss. And of course, what trading adventure does not constitute risk of life or risk of loss? So some profit was permitted. The short answer, though, is that there was really no difficulty in most of the large trading operations to turn themselves in a moment of metamorphosis from purely trading organizations to banks. Surplus capital could be then lent at interest, and everyone benefited. More capital was available, increasing the economic power of the town or city or family, and smaller organizations could have access to capital that was not possible. Similarly, kings and princes, those who needed money in order to try and undo the feudal restrictions on their power, could then borrow money from these bankers and use this money in order to circumvent the requirement of using feudal levies to fight wars, often against the very people who constituted the feudal levies. That catch-22 in the feudal system then, that always undermined the power of the central authority, was then negated, and it was possible to once more start creating larger territorial states. This then explosion of capital and new business techniques and new activities in the economy was something that provided a new measure of change and a new engine of change to the entire continent. But, especially initially, it was not without risk. It was risky for a number of reasons. First of all, it was always dangerous when setting out on long-distance trade. There were pirates. You were at war fighting Islam, and the Islamic pirates and those corsairs that were licensed to prey on Christian shipping were very effective. There was always disease, shipwreck, and all of the other things that attended long-distance trade. But then there was another danger from the very forces that to some extent should have been your closest allies. And that was the people who borrowed your money. An example should suffice to indicate just how dangerous it was to play in the arena of princes. Two of the greatest banks of medieval Europe, the family banks of the Bardi and Peruzzi from Florence, had made an enormous fortune in the 13th and 14th centuries. They, in fact, had become the largest banks on the continent. And they also helped bankroll both sides, the French and the English and their allies, during the 100 Years' War. Particularly in those years between 1336 and 1340, the Bardi and the Peruzzi made enormous profits by ensuring that this war would continue. However, by 1343, a situation arose that allowed for the King of England to recognize that, in fact, he could never repay his debts. Edward III was warned that he owed 900,000 gold florins to the Bardi and 600,000 gold florins to the Peruzzi. This enormous amount of money was more than he could ever hope to repay. And here again, the tension between the feudal structure and the absolute power of a reigning monarch and the relative weakness of even extremely wealthy international banks became evident, because Edward simply reneged on the loan. He simply repudiated the loan, and, being a prince as he was, he also exiled the Italians and confiscated their property. The result was the collapse of the Bardi and the Peruzzi banks. And this was not just a collapse of two banks. This was a collapse, in effect, of the European economy. Because these two banks had accumulated so much capital that they were able then to lend money to princes, but to accumulate that capital, they had to take money from almost anyone with any surplus wealth. From small artisans, shoemakers who were successful, small vintners who had a little bit of extra every month, to those who were trying to pay back loans to the Bardi and the Peruzzi and put everything in the bank. The collapse of the bank then did not just result in the collapse of the Bardi and the Peruzzi. It resulted in the collapse of all of those lesser traders and individuals who had put their savings and their hope of future income into them. The consequence was the European economy essentially collapsed. Not just the Florentine, not just the Italian, but the economy in general, because so much had been in fact lubricated by the operation of these two large financial institutions. The situation then in 1343 was very serious, but it was saved by a situation that was even more serious. There's a reason that economics is called the dismal science, and to some extent, the economy of Europe was saved by the greatest tragedy that Europe had then endured, the Black Death. In 1348-1349, a Genoese ship returning from the Black Sea carried with it a disease so virulent that it quickly swept across Europe, and depending where and depending when, up to half the population of the locality died. In large cities, at least half died. In the countryside, perhaps a third. Europe had seen nothing like it. And even today, to mention the Black Death is to send a frisson of terror down the spine. But there were, of course, extenuating circumstances which made this tragedy, that made this awful situation not only bearable, but actually something to celebrate. There were two things. First is that those workers and artisans, even the peasants attached to the land, who survived, saw their labor much more valued. There were not enough artisans. There weren't enough peasants to work the land in this collaborative system that was still functioning. So those that stayed were able to negotiate higher salaries, better working conditions, and altogether a much better quality of life. Similarly, artisans in the towns were able to then get higher wages and live more comfortably. Those that survived then were much better off in every element of society. But in fact, It's at the very top that the advantage was greatly felt. Those wealthy merchants that had been brought down by the Bardi and the Peruzzi found that they had lost their capital. However, what's called the inheritance effect recapitalized their businesses. Because of the patterns of patrician marriage, if your brother and uncle and father and cousin were of the same class, they were usually wealthy. But if your brother, uncle, father, and cousin died during the Black Death, you, as the only survivor, inherited all of their money. It once more was a concentration of capital. You inherited all the money of the people who died, and you were then able to take this capital and use it for new economic purposes. Consequently, it was ironically the Black Death of 1348, 1349 that actually helped recapitalize Europe and to ensure that this system would continue to operate and that the economy of Europe would continue to grow, despite the terrible crises of the bank failure of 1343 and the awful pandemic of 1348, 1349. There were other elements, though, that helped. Long before the Black Death, the problem of currency was a huge one. With the growth of towns and cities, it was necessary to have that medium of exchange that would allow money to be brought at great distances in order to acquire goods, and also for people to know exactly how much wealth they had by knowing the value of the money in which that wealth was calculated. The problem with money in the West is that the coining of species was in fact a sign of sovereignty. The result was many local feudal lords, as well as kings and princes, would coin their own money. But then they would be in quick need of cash, and so they would devalue their currency by mixing base metals with the gold and silver coin, resulting in wild fluctuations of the value of money. This was a serious problem if in fact you were a merchant. So you needed something that was going to ensure that the money that you had today would be worth the same tomorrow. And the Florentines and the Venetians, among the most sophisticated of all of the merchants on the Italian peninsula and the continent, realized that they had to make coins that would be recognized everywhere if they were going to continue to dominate long-distance trade. The result was the Florentine florin and the Venetian ducat. These coins maintained their gold value, and they were used as the standard against which other coins were in fact addressed. So the Florentine florin, the Venetian ducat, and the whole creation of a reliable coinage enriched the cities of Florence and Venice even more. It also provided a standard of coinage so that everybody could have some idea what the value of the coins might be. This also allowed for trade to expand, because once you know what money is worth, you're willing to take greater chances. And it was an opportunity then to focus more and more power and authority economically in the hands of those people who could ensure that the money retained their value, and that is merchants. Kings and princes who needed money did not have the same kind of commitment to a stable coinage. It took the mercantile cities like Florence and Venice to do this. So money was to a degree solved. There was a sense that there was a coinage that could be recognized over long distances, and so long-distance trade could once more be engaged in with a degree of security. But there were other elements too. There were other things that were necessary if you were going to try and put back a system that had been destroyed with the collapse of the Roman Empire. Coinage was one. The advantage of the Roman Empire is that everybody recognized the value of Roman coins. As long as the head of the emperor was on it and it was legitimate, you knew what it was worth and you knew that it was good. Well, that problem had been addressed by the 13th century, and similar to the other problem, and that is how to enforce contracts, had to be addressed as well. If you live in a world of feudal Europe, where power is really made on the point of a sword, where public power in private hands means that the law is determined by the whim, or arbitrary desire of an individual who happens to exercise power, it's in fact something that is not going to really assist with trade. So there needed to be a revival of law, and there was. Once more, it was the return to the ancient Romans and the recovery of Roman law in the 12th and especially 13th centuries, and the teaching of that law in universities and the spreading of that law as an instrument by which not only trade could occur, but also that some of the most divisive and most fragmentary elements of feudalism could be addressed. For example, if an individual prince or king wanted to try and undo some of the elements of feudalism, where the local lord had simply taken more and more of the authority that was due to the overlord under his own control, then you needed some mechanism to address this. As long as it was based on the exercise of power, very few instruments were available. But as soon as there was a recognized source of law in which the law would operate equally for everyone, then that sense of whim and that sense of arbitrary exercise of public power by private individuals would be mitigated to a great degree. The recovery of Roman law did exactly this. Partly it was the nature of Roman law itself. Once Roman law was recognized, there were principles in it that allowed the kings and princes to overcome some of the practices of feudalism. There were concepts like quod placuit principis vigorum legis habet. Whatever pleases the prince has the power of law, which means that sovereignty resides in the prince or king. It doesn't have much to do with the feudal pyramid, even though that was the role the prince or king played. It had to do with an idea of sovereignty, which is an abstraction based upon an interpretation of an idea. So kings and princes could take the revival of Roman law and use this. Moreover, once Roman law was beginning to be used and taught, there was then an established means of procedure. People knew how they could proceed because the procedure was known. The law could be quoted, and the obligations of everybody involved in this law could be sustained. In part, this is an extension of trade. You can't have trade unless you can have enforceable contracts. And the thing about Roman law is that it provided for enforceable contracts. So the expansion of trade also helped result in the expansion of Roman law and concepts that were implicit in Roman law. So what we see then is that the revival of trade had consequences well beyond the recapitalization of Europe, well beyond the extension of European economic interests across the continent and even into other parts of the world. It had an implication greater than the funding of the Crusades or even the building of territorial states. What it had, in fact, is the mechanisms and the instruments to allow for the creation of a different kind of civilization, a different kind of society, one that was based on the idea of law, however that law was interpreted, one that was based upon capital, that is, money provided privilege and power that could be used against the privilege of rank and birth. And then finally, the idea that the community operated according to different principles. It was no longer a subsistence world of protecting the locality and protecting the life and property of those in your vicinity. It now is a much broader concept of being part of an economic system, part of a larger political or economic unit, and part of a structure that could draw capital from almost anywhere and extend trade to almost anywhere. And again, we can see how this benefited and worked in a wonderful spiral, because those merchants who were called upon to lend money to princes, who were called upon to be the representatives of the third estates and parliaments and estates general, also realized that the central power, according to Roman law, could give them the things they needed, which the local rural feudal nobility had no interest in whatsoever. Standard weights and measures, roads that were maintained and kept safe, harbors that could be dredged, stable coinages, all of these things could be provided by a power that was outside the feudal system. These were things for which feudalism was not designed and for which the feudal class had no particular interest. So again, the unintended consequence of the revival of trade, the capitalization of Europe, and the extension of towns and cities was to build a different kind of civilization, was to build a civilization in which rank and birth could now be challenged by wealth and influence, where local feudal power could be challenged by centralized power and the rule of kings and princes according to a set of laws that were generally recognized. And once you have ideas like the rule of law, a standard coinage, and the recognition that there is a responsibility of the central government to provide general good for the largest number, then in fact the concept of the modern state is being born. And it is not an accident, and we will see it reach its fulfillment in the next lecture when we talk about humanism in the Italian Renaissance.